I'm Will Ruth, and this is the bonus content for my article in Volume 2, Issue 11 of Science of Rowing. I reviewed an article this month about the relationship of 2K erg performance and 1 repetition maximum strength in the hang clean and back squat in a team of female collegiate D1 rowers. Rowers and coaches often ask us about the topic of strength standards and the question of how strong is strong enough and how strong is too strong to perform well at rowing. You can read my review and ideas in this month's issue at the link below. In this bonus content, we'll talk with rowing performance expert Alex Wolf about some of his ideas on the topic of assessments and evaluations for rowers. So Alex, welcome. Please introduce yourself and give us a brief summary of the great work you've done in rowing over the last 20 plus years now, right?
Thanks, Will, for inviting me over to talk today. I've spent probably over a decade now working with rowing. I started back in 2009, I think it was, with British rowing up to about 2015, 2016, taking them through to the London Olympic Games and most of the journey up to the Rio Games. And then more recently, I've spent the last few years working with the Chinese rowing team as a consultant there. I recently published a book on strength conditioning for rowing, which I think was published last year, and I co-authored a book with the then chief coach of the British programme, Paul Thompson, around how to train rowers to improve performance and how you can link strength conditioning much more aligned to the coach's philosophical approach. So yeah, that's my kind of background in rowing, and spent a lot of time now around coach and practitioner development around strength conditioning.
And how'd you get into rowing in the first place? What brought you to our sport?
Chance, I think, is probably the best way to describe it. I was previously working with the British athletics team up to that point, and there was a lot of transition going on within the sport post the Beijing Olympic Games, and then the opportunity arose to apply for a job within the rowing program as in a kind of much more leadership based role. So I applied for that and went through what actually ended up being like a 3-month interview process of doing loads of freebie stuff for them for a long period of time before I actually signed a contract to start working for them. And actually that's probably the two things I ended up really benefiting from going through that process and actually working with rowing. One is kind of working out how much I enjoyed working with that type of sport, but two, also the role that it provided me as well in terms of developing me as a technical strength coach, but also as in a leadership role, having to manage more people under me within the team. So it was more chance than anything else, but probably it's been the longest focus of my career than any other part that I've focused on.
Yeah. That's one of the things that I liked about your book, and one of the things I've seen you talk write about online too, is that it's not, you can apply many of the principles beyond just the sport of rowing, that it's strength conditioning for rowing, and the way that you can kind of approach that from the lens of physical development rather than just the rowing side of it. Although obviously there is a lot of rowing specific information and examples in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the book was clearly written for a rowing population, but I think it captures an awful lot of my thoughts within around strength conditioning, and just almost in that book, sport just becomes the kind of the living case study of how to apply those principles. And I think one of the roles I had was head of strength conditioning for the English Institute of Sport, which was overseeing 70 plus strength coaches across 39 different Olympic and Paralympic sports. So I had to have a kind of a real diverse understanding of how strength conditioning can have an impact. And yeah, at the start of the book, we talk about this idea. What I talk about this idea is that strength conditioning is not the event itself. And it's about the idea that we need to stop looking at trying to improve, or taking strength conditioning alone as looking at that as being successful, looking at that being successful without really understanding how that impacts on the wider performance of rowing. And the idea is that we need to start thinking about how performance improves with strength conditioning, and not just judging our performance as a strength coach within the weight room. So it's almost irrelevant how much they can squat, because the last time I looked, it was how fast you rode 2,000 meters at one races. So actually, we need to really understand why we would squat in the first place to even help a rower row a faster 2,000 meter race. And I think what we've found over the last few years as strength coaches, we judge our performances on what we see in the weight room or in the types of training we do, and we say, hey, look, we've made these athletes better. So therefore, that's not limiting, but actually we haven't really considered how that really links back to the performance question of how do you row 2,000 meters or whatever distance faster than you have done previously.
Yeah, and that gets right to the heart of the question of the article that I reviewed and the article that I wrote this month in Science of Rowing about how do we use assessments off the water to understand how rowers are going to perform on the water, because I think that that's one of the huge challenges of rowing, especially when you're talking about team boats, is that it's not track and field or athletics where we can see an individual performance kind of clearly correlating to the way that that individual has improved. Obviously, there are those examples in rowing, but how do you kind of see our role as strength coaches for rowers in that improving their performance off the water to how it translates on water?
Yeah, so it's a really good and important question for us to properly dissect. And by no means do I have all the answers and claim to have it right. But I think there are some real key fundamental things that we really need to consider. And I think it goes back to that quote of stop making S&C look good and start making performance look good. When we apply principles of strength conditioning, or we create a program to create a change within a rower's physical, technical performance, we need to know, first of all, the reasoning for why we need to make that change, how that change will make a difference in performance, how much of that change is required, and how long that change is going to take, and be confident that it will actually do what it says it does. And I think that's the first bit. So it becomes, if we go from the outcome first and work backwards from that, then it becomes really easy then to start dissecting about what assessments we might want to use. So if we're looking at off-water performance assessments, well, the reason we might want to use gym-based or use strength training methodologies is to try and change a force characteristic of the rowers, and predominantly it's going to be a hip and knee based training program for the lower body, which we're trying to improve the maximal force expression, maybe the rate of force characteristics of the hip and knee. So while we can't directly measure that on the water, but we can assess the effectiveness of the change we've created in the weight room. So we can then start looking at the assessment that we put in place to do that. So actually, one of the things we need to be mindful of is that force and load or weight are not the same thing. So a 1RM is very different to completing an isokinetic or an isometric force assessment. So we need to be really clear with our language about what we're trying to change. We're trying to change force, and we need to try and find a force measurement. So I think that's where this idea of this kind of the 5R model kind of comes into play, which helps us kind of dissect where we might want to go with some of our assessments, because while there are clearly wrong assessments to do, but the way in which we organize our assessments, that it gives us a much greater diversity if we can stick to these 5Rs. And we talk about relevance, reliability, representativeness, if it's real and it's relatable. And if we go in each of those in sequence, and the relevance is, how relevant is the assessment or the test to the specific question or outcome we're trying to change? And what we mean by that is if we are looking for an off-water performance change, which we know will have an improvement in performance, and we need to find the most effective way to measure that. So I spoke about the squat and the difference between squatting and force production. Actually, one of the most important things is to recognize that when we make a change, is it relevant? How do we test that relevance to it? So from a force bit, it might require looking at isometric hip and knee extension forces, or if we don't have that, then looking at a proxy of strength changes, or sorry, load changes within strength training. And while it's not a direct measure, it's about as good as you're going to get without having to spend a huge amount of money on expensive equipment. So the relevance becomes really important about, does it answer the question that you're trying to solve. This next bit is a reliability piece, which is, if you were to repeat that test, would you get the same repeatable setup every single time? And the repeatability is really about you as a tester. Are you able to repeat the test process in the identical fashion that it's set out to be? Does the individual who completed the test repeatedly complete it in the same way? Which is a really simple thing. So if we're looking at using 2K ergos or looking at shorter sprint ergos and so on, like the setup of the ergo becomes really important. So like foot stretcher height is a really obvious one, that if you have your feet are in exactly the same position at the same height setting, the drag factor is at the same setting. Well, that's a reliable measure, because you're being able, the athlete is able to repeat the process identically, and then the test process is the same as well. So again, are you measuring 2,000 meters, or are you measuring 2001 or 2002 meters? And that's a little bit kind of obtuse and kind of saying you wouldn't do 2002 meters, but it's making sure that the test is actually set up for 2,000 meters, and that keeps that reliability in place for both you, you as a tester, the person who's being tested, and the test procedure.
What about one factor in that too is how the athlete is approaching the test, or how the athlete is set up for the test. So for a 2K, we can do a surprise 2K, and that's going to be different than if the athlete is tapered for the 2K. What the motivational setting is for the athlete. We've reviewed some other research that just the kind of information that the athlete sees on the screen versus if they're hearing it from a coxswain, what kind of motivation the athlete is exposed to.
Yeah. So absolutely. So like there's I can't remember the terminologies called now, but it's the idea of kind of focusing on actually what you're doing, or it's the idea of almost distraction and trying to bury yourself, that it's not really happening. Those kind of two extremes, and people will fall somewhere at each pole in the middle. And the idea of motivation has a massive impact on test performances. And even looking at simple things like counter movement jumps, there is a large amount of evidence demonstrating that those who get external cues or external motivation from other people improves performance. If you have a target to jump at, that increases performance. So all of those things clearly have from motivational, from internal and external cues, that there are clearly things that will have that. That said, the intention is to, whether you throw in a 2K surprise test or it's a tapered test, the manner in which you as a tester, them as a testee, in terms of setting it up and the way the test is actually completed, doesn't change. So you can be quite confident that the test is repeatable and reliable in that sense. And so if you do change all those things around it, then the change is based upon the reason why you put the surprise in, rather than it being because the test wasn't set up properly, or they didn't set their foot stretch at the right height, or whatever it might be. So yeah, those things are really important. And a bit the way I look at it is like a funnel. Like the more you control, the narrower the funnel gets down, and the degree of variability in the test results gets smaller. If you don't control at the top of the funnel and you let people do whatever, there's high degrees of variability of where the test data might sit. And we can't remove all variability unless you go into a proper laboratory. And even then there's a degree of variability within there, but we can reduce all those things. Yeah, the human, us, remove us as being the limiting factor. Yeah.
But the erg itself is a great tool in terms of like starting from that point, as long as we're setting it up carefully. The reliability between ergs is pretty excellent.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, if we set it up same time same way every single time, then we're pretty confident that a change that you see is going to be based upon the actual athlete, rather than it being something else.
So that was representative. The third of your R's.
So that's number two. That's still the reliability. The representative bit does that test? Is it representative of that characteristic? So if you're looking at it from an on-water or off-water or ergo-based bit, why do we test the 2K performance, or the 2K performance, is a good marker for rowing populations of potential aerobic and anaerobic contribution to a 2K race. And actually, if you have two good strong 2K performance on that, then it's likely to cross over in terms of you have the physical qualities to produce that on the water, not necessarily the technical, because it's a slightly different mechanical position. If you look at it from a strength or a weight room based bit, there's no point testing, say, press ups to measure strength, because it's not representative of the maximum force that you can produce. So you just need to make sure the test does represent what the change that you're looking for. And then the next bit is about the change, the amount of change. So when we talk about the reliability and the representativeness, if the test is set up effectively and it's consistent, and we know that there's no change in the way the test has been completed, then we know anything that we see is going to be a real change. And what we mean by that is, if it's improved, then we know that actually it's the athlete that has made that improvement, and it's not the way the test has been completed. Or if they've got worse, it's again because the athlete hasn't been able to complete the test at the relevant level, and not the test itself. And then the last bit is the relatability, which is around the kind of the athlete and how they understand about the test, they understand the test and why they might care about it. So this goes back to your point around the motivation bit. An athlete doesn't care. They're never going to actually, like a 2K test or a 1RM test or whatever, they're hard work. And obviously they're two extremes in terms of time and intensity, but they're still really hard work. So if they don't care about it, they're very unlikely to go hard on it and actually get a fair representation of themselves. So they need to understand why it cares, which then goes right the way back to the relevant piece at the very beginning of, like, if they can see how it's relevant to the change they're making, then the chances are they're going to have a bit more kind of directed mental effort, I suppose, to go hard on it and actually give a full representation of themselves. And if they don't, well, then it's not a lot you can really do about that. You can only take the data for what it is. But the one thing we've gone, sorry,
speaks to the communication factor too for the coach, that whether you're the rowing coach or the strength coach or on the support staff, the way that you present the test to the athlete has a big effect on the outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, and take it away from sport or rowing, full stop. Like, how frustrated do you get when you get told to do something without being told the reason for doing it?
Yeah.
Like, everybody wants to know the why. Well, why am I doing that? Whether that's, I don't know.
Well, you're a parent of young kids, so I assume this is something close to home, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, my youngest is 3, and she will always go why at least 4 or 5 times, and she's kind of got to the age now where telling her, so wait, you just have to, doesn't cut it anymore. So she needs to know why she's doing it. She's a little bit literal as well. So when you tell her things, like, she needs to know exactly what both kids are really literal, but it's the simple things as well. So if I'm being told I need to move the car off the driveway, like, I want to know why I'm taking the car off the driveway, and just being told you've got to do it doesn't make sense, and it frustrates me. And the same, an athlete will feel exactly the same. It's just human nature. They're being told they're going to do something, they need to understand why it's being there. So the communication bit is absolutely critical from all support staff. And even when you communicate it, you'll find that some people just still don't get it, or can't see the connection. And the connection piece is probably the most important part around it, that they need to be able to feel like they're part of that, and that it connects to where they want to go. And if they can't do that, then we failed as coaches. We were on a course a few weeks ago in Italy, delivering some strength conditioning stuff, and we're going through the testing bit. But one of the things we always get the people to do is to write notes alongside the data that they're collecting, to actually give a narrative basically of what happened. And that's purely on the basis for what we've just described there. If you feel the athlete's not doing what they said they're set out to do, then actually we need to make a note of that. So actually they didn't give them, you could see that they weren't going hard on that. So actually it may not be a fair representative of that. And it's just, that's where interpretation of data becomes really important too.
It's an interesting potential weakness in any sports science that we try to make the testing environment or the lab environment as sterile as possible, basically, to try to take out a lot of those motivational factors. But then when you're an actual coach or an athlete and you're in a practical setting, it's really important that we add all those factors back in. So we might say,
Yeah.
hey, we're going to have you do these 5 tests in a lab and see how they correlate to performance. Don't give them any more information than that because it might bias them in your study. But then when you're an actual coach, you need their best performance to understand exactly how each of those is going to carry over.
Yeah, and there lies one of the greatest flaws in human studies, is when you try to remove the human factor out of being human,
Right.
You lose the very essence of why people are motivated or unmotivated to do something. And I think that's the challenge. Is like if you're in a rowing program or in a sports program, in any setting, you're there because you probably want to compete, and so the degree of competition is a part of the actual experience of being in that bit there. So as soon as you remove that motivation or that competitiveness out of it, you're actually dehumanizing the experience of what they're trying to achieve. So the studies will try and account for that by removing kind of those motivational cues, etc. But the reality becomes that actually they are the bits that you cannot account for in why people perform the way they do.
And that's why we try with Science of Rowing to, here's the article, here's what they found, here's the limitations, but now we're going to talk from our perspective as coaches and rowers and bringing in other experts of how do we actually interpret this, use this, what are the strengths and potential weaknesses. And with that in mind, pretty much all rowing research generally finds that stronger, fitter athletes are overall better rowers. And that doesn't much change whether we're evaluating, in this study, it was a hang clean and a back squat, or if we're using, a hinge movement or a counter movement jump. But what have you found in your own practical experience as far as gym tests that map well to rowing potential or rowing performance?
Yeah, so it's a lot. It's probably the first way. I'm just trying to order my thoughts, which make it more coherent. So interestingly, one of the biggest things I found was if you looked at across all the rowers in the program, males, females, lightweights, heavyweights, that actually the single biggest predictor of 2K ergo performance was how much that individual power clean from the floor. And that had about, I think, 92% of the variation in that difference could be, or in that relationship could be accounted for by how much you cleaned. So what that shows is obviously heavyweight men are heavier and stronger than lightweight men who are slightly or probably similar or just similar weightish to heavyweight women who are stronger than them. Heavyweight women are stronger than lightweight women. So you get this kind of really nice kind of linear regression between the two, is that there is a relationship between those kind of force or strength characteristics around that. When we look at that a little bit deeper, we found that for the open weight men, or heavyweight men, the biggest determinants to 2K performance were actually more around upper body strength, which is really random. That actually bench press performance and bench pull performance became good predictors of about 70% of 2K ergo time. It could be predicted by what they could press and pull. We looked at that even deeper. Those who had the biggest difference between press and pull, in terms of press being significantly greater than their pull, had the highest absolute value. So if you had 150 odd kilo bench press, your bench pull was about 115 to 120 kilos. Then you had this next group who were around about 100 to 105 to 110 kilos and had fairly equal press and pull. And then you had kind of the weaker athletes who had bigger pulls and presses, and all of their pulls were below 100 kilos and their bench presses were just a little bit lower than their pull. So there's a real indication of two things. There's that upper body strength, and I've got to be careful what I say here. It's a homogenous group of highly elite male athletes within the British program, and may not be representative everywhere else, but upper body was a differentiating factor when all other factors were really close to each other. When you look at the VO2 maxes, 2K times, all quite narrow, but we had a really large bandwidth. That's where the biggest bandwidth of difference was in the upper body strength. So if you want to improve or so I don't want to improve that. I can't really say that. Upper body strength is important for male rowers in that setting for us. If we wanted to improve pool performance, which a lot of the coaches wanted, we had to improve press far greater than what the pool performance was. So that's one thing we found. We also found that 100 meters power strokes and 250 meter sprints were all really high on ergos, were highly indicative of how fast they could row 2,000 meters. So there was, again, between 60 and 80%, 60 to 80% of the relationship, or 60 to 80% of the variation in 2K time could be determined by just how quickly they could row a short ergo or do a power stroke. Now, when we looked at that further, we found in the women's population that how much you back squatted and how much mean power you could produce on a counter movement jump accounted for almost 95% of your 100 meter or your seven power stroke performance. So the real indication that there is being strong and being powerful, having high capability of producing force, a high capability of producing velocity specific tasks, had a really strong indication on how fast you could row 100 meters or 7 power strokes, which had a really strong indication of how fast you could row 2,000 meters. So you can kind of work your way backwards, 2,000 meters down to 100 meters, down to the weight room performances. Now, what became really interesting is when you started looking at all of the athlete populations, that we found that if you were strong in one exercise, you were strong in all the exercises. If you were average in one exercise, you were average in all the exercises. And if you were poor in one exercise, you tended to be poor in all the exercises. And we did something called a principal component analysis, which kind of looks at these statistical groups of different, of all the populations, and you have your first principle, second and third principles. And it basically just shows you how all the tests or all the exercises are related, and that's where those were all kind of highlighted. So if you were strong, you tend to be strong everywhere, which doesn't surprise you, because you've probably seen rowers who are just generally gifted in the weight room, and then you've got the rowers who aren't particularly gifted in the weight room, and they find it a lot harder. And that kind of gave some real nice kind of clarity on some of that stuff. The other thing we found, and this was with the open women, was when we started looking at power strokes and we started changing drag factors and stroke rates, that when with all rowers on the power strokes, power per stroke decreased as stroke rate increased, which is expected. But the stronger athletes, or the ones that you'd have who had better weight room performances, the degree of decline was a lot smaller than those who were the worse gym performance people. So the rate of decline for the best was really shallow. The rate of decline in power per stroke was a lot greater with the weaker athletes. So it really demonstrated that the impact of your strength capabilities or your weight room capabilities, or just your ability to produce force at high speed, had a big impact on on stroke rate. And particularly when you start looking at bigger boats, where stroke rates increase significantly greater than what they would be in a pair or a double, then actually that has a real performance impact. So then it gives us real clarity around, if you want rowers to move big boats quickly and have high stroke rates, then their ability to produce high forces and produce those high forces at high speed is going to be limiting for them. And that's something we can directly impact in the weight room. So there's some real clarity on some of the things that we worked with around that. I want to stop there because I could probably go on about there's 6 more hours of stuff in there.
Yeah. I mean, there's a ton there, and rather than one specific factor, what stands out to me is the sheer amount of data and the sheer number of factors that you collected, and talking about open weight versus lightweight and male versus female. And when we have this homogenous population versus someone with more diverse training experience, we're rowing big boats, we're rowing small boats. Sort of the big question that we can finish on here is, do you think that we could ever generalize an internal set of testing protocols or data to strength standards for rowers broadly, which is what sort of other people have tried to do, to say, well, if you're a junior rower, period, here's what you should be hitting. If you're a college rower, here's what you should be hitting, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't have standards, but I do have, I suppose, principles which I think are really important. I think all rowers should have a power profile over different distances on ergos. I think if you go from like a 5K, 2K, 500, 250 power strokes, then you'll get a power profile of what they can produce. And I'm not necessarily looking at it from a kind of a physiological perspective. You will get more physiological in terms of cardiorespiratory on 2 and 5s, 5Ks. But on those end bits, what you should be able to see is like power per stroke. And if we're looking for the kind of like the kind of representativeness of testing, that is going to be a really clear measure of the impact that we're having on rowers. Because you're going to see peak powers, and you're going to see peak powers at slightly longer distances changing with the work we do as strength coaches. So I would definitely say that's one thing that we can all do. And most people, or most clubs and organizations, will have some ergo of some description, which they can capture that kind of information. So I do think that's important. The bit I would say to that is, it isn't that hard to collect that type of information and store it well, and do some really basic analysis of what your means are, what the range is from the lowest to the highest time, or the slowest to the quickest times, and doing some kind of really basic analysis on the information. And it only takes a season of collecting that information for you to establish your own standards. And I said only a season, but I had to start somewhere. I had no data before I went into any of the roles that I did, and it took a season for us to collect that. And we just carried on collecting it, and probably the British rowing program still collecting it. So that's 12, 13 years of data they've collected now. So you've got to
can't
start
just
somewhere.
test once and then jump to all these conclusions.
No, yeah. Absolutely. The second area I would look at, and I haven't really discussed it here, but I talk about it in the book, shameless plug of the book, but in one of the latter chapters, I talk about trunk training, and I talk specifically around work capacity and the ability of the trunk to tolerate huge volumes of training load. And all the types of training that and testing I do for performance and for injury, the one thing I always come back to is capacity testing for the trunk, and it's quadrant testing. So it's prone extension, supine extension, and lateral left, lateral right hold, time to failure. And that gives us a really good indication of just how capable a rower's trunk is in terms of having a good degree of work capacity. And if they've got poor work capacity, then their probability is that they are either going to not tolerate the training program, or they're going to break down from the training volume. So developing trunk capacity alongside your and testing your trunk capacity alongside your kind of ergo testing, I think are the two kind of stall marks that I'd always go for. The rest of it, whether you use force plates or you use 1RMs or 3RMs or whatever other assessments, it almost becomes irrelevant for me. I think that the ergo testing and the trunk testing become the two things, because I think the trunk becomes primarily the single biggest limiting factor in performance. If it becomes injured, or it just cannot tolerate 200 kilometers a week on the water, and if you can't do that, then how will you ever make a physical, or sorry, a kind of a force or a physiological or a technical change when the trunk becomes the thing that stops you from doing that? And that's obviously a massive broad brushstroke, but those would be the two things which I always go back to. And whenever I present on this stuff, is you can only go and do two things. You've got ergos, easy, you can measure that. Everybody's got a bench or something that a rower can hang off the side of to do a test, and everyone has a watch or a clock to be able to measure time. Really simple things, and will give you some really clear standards. The standards, I think, for the trunk are higher for general population. So I would generally say a prone extension, left, right, lateral hold, you'd probably, for a sub-elite and development athletes, you're looking at around 2 minutes. For an anterior trunk, you're looking about 30% less than that. So you're looking probably around 1 minute 20 odd seconds as a kind of standard for that. And again, I know it's a shameless plug, but the book goes into really good detail about, one, how to perform the assessments really effectively and get that kind of repeatability and reliability that we're looking for. But it also goes through the standards of of what the test scores show you, and how you then write a training program off the back end of that. And I think that's the most important bit for me, is that all the tests should inform your decision making about your training, which is why I think the ergo tests become really good, because it informs you about your power profiles at lower distance, high intensity work, and the trunk training gives you some real clarity about where the weaknesses in the trunk exist. So that would be the two things I would go hard on.
That's great. And we'll have links in the show notes to where people can find your book, which I'll back you up on all of that. I love, I mean, especially for the topic of talking about testing, you've got pictures that show here's how the test ought to be done, very clear descriptions. And those are critical factors, because you can say a minute, 20 seconds for this test, but if I'm not doing the test the same way, then I'm not going to get the same result. So I can't apply that data.
Yeah, absolutely. And I even show what the errors in the test look like. Mm-hmm. And just to give you an example, if you're just hanging off the edge of a bench, the prone extension, like with like a 2 or 3 centimeter drop in your shoulder height, can increase the test time by a minute or so. So you can artificially inflate that. So that's why it's so important that we have this kind of reliability within that. So yeah, absolutely.
And where can people find more from you, and what's new or coming up for you in early 2022 that they should look for?
So we've just launched Strength and Conditioning Academy, which is a learning education portal for around, funny enough, around strength and conditioning. The first course is coming out probably the end of November, which is going to be looking at problem solving within strength and conditioning. So it's not going to be content driven; it's going to be problem solving driven. So a lot of the things I've spoken to about today will be discussed, and giving you frameworks and processes to work through to start working out how to work backwards on performance and so on. So you can go to strengthconditioning.academy, and you can sign up for that. You can get the first lesson for free at the moment as well, so you get a bit of a taste of what the course is all about, and the first lesson really digests that kind of idea of problem solving and the two sides of it, or clarity of outcome and the solutions that you have to try and solve the outcome. So that's of interest to you, you can look at that. And then in the new year, we're definitely having a much more of a how to describe it, the non-technical side of coaching, so the art and act of coaching. So we've got something I think it's going to be called the anatomy of a coach, and kind of the interpersonal and the emotional intelligence skills that are required for that, which will be more in person to start with. By the end of the year, it will be much more online stuff. So keep your eyes out if you're interested in that kind of stuff too.
Fantastic. And are you much on social media, or do you have a main brand where people can find you?
So the company's one is SC_Academy on Twitter and Instagram, and I think on Facebook as well. And then my personal one is Alex P. Wolf on Instagram and Twitter, although I'm horrific at actually being on it that often, but I am getting better.
Fantastic. Well, links to all of that below, and thanks again so much for your time.
Thanks, Will.